Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens, and this is Carly Stevens Books for all things writing, publishing, and indie author life. Today, I want to talk about 8 mistakes that new fantasy writers make. All right, so here are 8 mistakes that are really common that I want to help you avoid. I have not only written fantasy for quite a few years, but I've also taught creative writing and critiqued a lot of fantasy work. So here are some of the most common issues that I dealt with, both for myself and that I see with others. So number one of the most common is when writers describe what's happening without having the reader experience it. Now, there are lots of different ways to do narration. I've talked about lots of them on the channel, and I'll continue to talk about different writing styles, but sometimes, especially with fantasy, when there is so much usually going on right at the beginning, where maybe somebody's being chased by a dragon or there's, an invasion of some kind, what happens is the writer will get caught up in just explaining what's happening. So they ran into the bunker, the soldiers surrounded it, and there's not that sense of actually being in the shoes of the main character. So if you want to make your story more engaging, to make people really care about what's happening instead of just hearing about a story, having them experience it, you can take a look at my video on deep POV, deep point of view. That is one of the primary ways that I've found to overcome that just hearing about a story issue and instead putting the reader into the shoes of the character. When you do that, people are going to care not only more about your character, but also about your world and anything else that you may tell them about the magic, etc. Number 2 is info dumping. I know that you knew this was going to be on the list, but often what I'll see is when a new character, creature, society is introduced, often what you'll get is this dump of information. How large was the creature? We get exact measurements at times, and unless that makes sense with the kind of story, the kind of protagonist we're following, it does not make sense to pause and give us this very long explanation of this new element that's being introduced. So it can be hard to find the balance between making things very clear for the reader and then info dumping. So if you would like some additional tips for that, let me know. But some things that spring immediately to mind: make sure that you are telling the story through the eyes of the point of view character in the scene. If the character wouldn't stop and think about the exact measurements of this creature, then maybe just give it a ballpark. What matters to the main character? Is it that this creature is huge and is actually coming after them? Is it that it's much smaller than they expected because it had always been described as something as tall as a tree? Giving us more information through the eyes of personality and character is going to move the story forward, keep things relevant while giving us information without pausing the story to do so. Number 3 is stuffing too many characters into the story too early. So there are several genres that struggle with this the most, I think, but fantasy, especially epic fantasy, is so vast and has such a huge cast of characters in this larger than life sometimes world. That's part of what we love about it. We get immersed and it feels like it's populated with all these interesting people. But if you are writing epic fantasy and you introduce a bunch of people early, that doesn't give the reader enough time to remember who they are, to distinguish between them, to care about them. So unless you're really adept at introducing a lot of characters early, I would advise against that. I have a whole video on how to handle large casts of characters in a story. So with the Tenured Academy series, I'm not going to say that it's a perfect work of literature. As I've gotten better at writing, I can see different things that I would do differently now, which is a good thing, right? I'm 5, 6, 7 years down the road in my writing journey, as a serious author. But one thing that I think did go pretty well is introducing characters at a moderate pace. We meet our main character, we meet his family, we meet the cast kind of expands outward rather than being introduced to everybody all at once. Number 4, the next issue to avoid is making magic solve problems. Now, if there's magic in the world, of course, people are going to consider magical solutions to problems. That's not the issue. The issue is when there is a magical spell or ability that has not been established earlier, that all of a sudden can swoop in like some Deus Ex Machina, savior, and pluck people out of their situation. That feels fake, that feels false. You're going to lose some of the trust of your readers if magic keeps solving problems instead of the characters using their ingenuity. So this is one of the strengths of having a very specific magic system. I have a video on magic systems as well. There are 2 kind of schools of magic systems. There's the Gandalf sparkly, we're not quite sure what it does magic. We see it in Narnia. And then there is the magic with rules, and we see the limits of the magic. We see people trying to push those limits. We see what happens when that goes down. We know what's involved in making magic happen. So that's like the 10 Year Academy series, or Brandon Sanderson always has those rules around his magic as well. So one of the strengths of having that rule-bound magic system in place is that you can establish all of that and then use it as an additional tool for not only the characters but also the readers to think through as a potential solution to the problems that they're facing, rather than having something apart from the characters just solving problems willy-nilly, so there's not that sense of stakes or danger. Number 5 is another issue that I see not only with fantasy, with other genres as well, but fantasy is a massive culprit with this, and that's having characters only talk about the plot. Again, if you have a fantasy that is vast, there's a lot going on. Maybe you have Game of Thrones style politics, maybe you have these huge societies that all, whatever it is, right? And there's a lot happening, and we need to keep track of all those things. It's true, so you need all these touch points with the reader to remind them of the stakes, what's going on, where are we, who are these people. But one way that people can fall into a trap here is by having the characters only talk about plot, only talk about things that are going to move the plot forward in a very obvious fashion. That ends up sounding stilted. Again, we're not going to care about the characters as much because that's not how we as people speak, even if we're in the midst of an intense crisis that we need to solve or talk about, or we're on a journey or something. People are just not built to only talk shop 100% of the time, even if they're very, very focused. So you feel the freedom to give your characters character moments, and remember that moving the plot forward is not only what's happening externally, taking down the evil empire or whatever it is that your characters are trying to accomplish in the story, but also there's another layer of plot and change that's going to happen, and that is the internal journey of the character. What changes for them over time? How do they overcome their flaws? Are they confronted with the reality of how their belief systems are harming people? Things like that. So establishing kind of a before, during, and after of the internal journey of your character is at least as important as that external change that's happening around them or that they're affecting. So having characters only talk about the plot, not the best way to go. Instead, let the story breathe a little bit and remember that this is largely about the people. So if you're wondering about that balance, I would say for the first draft, don't worry about it too much. Try to just bring your characters to life, and then when you get beta readers, early readers for this story, then you can ask questions about the dialogue. Does it seem stilted? Do you know the characters, or do they just feel like they're kind of, they're one role and that's all they're doing? All right, next one, and this was something that I definitely have had to work on, and I think I've become much more adept at it because I really worked hard, and that is having disorienting time or location jumps. In the 10 Unit Academy series, I'm just going to give you full transparency here. I had some pretty disorienting time jumps, location jumps. It was not always easy to tell how much time had passed, or if so much time had passed with this character, what was going on with the other character, was it matching up, and all that kind of thing. So a lot of the revision process involved smoothing out those timelines. That was one of the later revisions, but I think it's much better now than it was. In fact, I know it's much better now than it was. So, although you shouldn't info dump, pause, explain, just giving a sense of exactly how much time has passed, especially, again, if you're writing epic fantasy or something similar, where time does pass, maybe years or weeks of travel or whatever it might be. You can even have something as simple as a tag like 3 weeks later, comma, and then you continue on with that scene. Just make sure that your audience is fully oriented to which character point of view, which, how much time has passed since the previous scene, and how does it connect meaningfully to that previous scene, and where are you? Those are things that should become clear very, very quickly in every scene. So I have a video on my other channel, English Nerd, which used to be my one channel for everything, but that didn't make a whole lot of sense. That's all about showing time passing, because as I was learning about this, as I was looking at different ways that time can be shown or explained or clarified in a story, I decided for myself, first and foremost, to solidify all the different ways I saw that actually worked in a variety of other books that I read. So you can check that out if that is something that you struggle with as well. Like I said, I've worked on it, and I think I'm set now, even with my stories that do have similar time jumps. All right, next one is hard to pronounce names. Now, there are a couple caveats with this. Some people are just bad at pronouncing names, and that's fine. It doesn't need to be something that exists in the real world for people to pronounce it. It doesn't need to be a set of only Western names, because a lot of white people read books. However, it should be ideally sound outable, or at a minimum, if you want to use, say, Welsh names. I started reading a fantasy that is based on Welsh mythology, and anybody who's looked at Welsh and is not Welsh themselves can tell you that it is not intuitive how some of these names should be pronounced. So having a pronunciation guide at the beginning of your book, if it's not a set of names that you can sound out. For example, I tried to hit the kind of spot where it's not a recognizable name exactly, but you can sound it out. And if people mispronounce the name, I tend not to correct anybody, because that is their pronunciation of the character, and that doesn't really bother me. In fact, there are some terms, just one or two, that my audiobook narrator pronounces a little bit different than I heard it in my head, even though I gave him the pronunciations. And I thought, that's perfectly fine. Maybe that's how they say it in England in this world. No, that doesn't make any sense, but you get the idea. It's not a huge deal, but it shouldn't just be a bunch of letters put together that are really, really hard to pronounce. So like I was saying, in the 10 Unit Academy series, you have Firion, you have Bellic, you have Jory. You have these names that are, not common names, but they're ones that you can sound out, and they don't turn into that kind of, the adults in the Peanuts just blur a sound in your mind as you're reading. You can go, okay, yeah, of course, Bard and Kyria and whoever, right? So hard to pronounce names, avoid them, or if you want to expand to harder to pronounce names for some of that cultural difference, just be aware that having a pronunciation guide is going to be really helpful for your readers. And then the last one is another issue that I had early on in my writing career that I hope I've improved. I've really spent some quality time with this concept, and it was so simple but such a game changer for me, and I hope it's something that you're able to avoid and do better as well. So basically it boils down to, like, do you have a magic system, and or the same concept applies to a major threat to your fictional society? Magic system or threat to your fictional society. And can we tell that by the way that people other than the main character live their lives? I'm just going to say that again. Can you tell that there is a magic system and what kind it is, or that there is a threat by the way that characters other than your main character live their lives? If magic exists, then it's going to change some things. A really good example of this, there are lots of them, but an example that I love to point to is Jonathan Stroud's The Lockwood & Co. series about a ghost hunting agency of teenagers who go and take care of ghosts in London. So in this story, they're not in a fictional world, but they're in a fictional version of the real world. And the essential difference is that ghosts have invaded London and only children are able to see the ghosts, adults are not. So it's not only the main characters who are affected by this huge difference from the existing world. Instead, buildings are built differently, curfews are in place. There are all these things that are ripple effects to that magical addition to the real world. So in your fantasy story, if, for example, in the Tenuan Academy series, people can enter this unreal imaginary space and interact, but only if they're born with this ability, that raises all kinds of different questions. And how do you use that ability? What are the limits of it? Do people use it to convey information? Do they use it to fight? Do they use it to whatever? And so a lot of people know about this ability and they use it in a variety of different ways that people would use that ability. So yeah, those are 8 common mistakes that new fantasy writers tend to commit that I would like you to avoid. If you're interested, by the way, in getting a signed copy of this humongous complete edition of the Tenuan Academy series for the holidays, head on over to my website, carly-stevens.com. And I still have some copies left. You can order those for yourself if you just want to treat yourself, or somebody who loves fantasy. All right, best of luck to you out there with your fantasy story. Like this video if you like it, and don't forget to subscribe for more writing, publishing, and indie author life stuff. Until next time.